Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I always look forward to the festival every year. It was an amazing treat to get to see Karen Coonrad's King Lear a couple different times this weekend over at the University Theater, and I'm so glad that we have some further conversation about this play today. Just two sentences that were in the festival website, which I think provide a useful introduction to the ideas that we're going to be grappling with today, which is that no work of English literature speaks more directly to human vulnerability in the face of climate disruption than Shakespeare's King Lear. And those two things, the play itself and the legacy of the play that many of us saw this weekend, and the vulnerability that we all feel in the face of a changing and heating environment, are the two things that I want us to be talking about today, both the three of us here and maybe some questions from the audience later. The old king, thrust outside into the storm by himself, feels our environmental weakness on his skin. And our conversation today between the three of us, with some special performance elements as well, some of which will be passed out to the audience, will try to think about how Shakespeare thinks about environmental vulnerability, and also how we think about it and might think about it differently in the present. So before we get started, I'll just introduce our three panelists here. Starting in the center with David Sterling Brown, a lifelong Connecticut resident who is also an associate professor of English at his undergraduate alma mater at Trinity College in Hartford. David is an award-winning Shakespeare and critical race studies scholar whose research, teaching, and public speaking interests include African American literature, dramatic literature, mental health, gender, performance, sexuality, and the family. His great new book, Shakespeare's White Others, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2023 and is also available in an audiobook narrated by the author. And as someone who has listened to the audiobook, I can concur that it is a really awesome performance of a great book. And so I like run out and get the audiobook. David is also the creator of the 3D virtual reality David Sterling Brown Gallery and curating the gallery's first exhibition, Visualizing Race Virtually, as a visual component to Shakespeare's White Others. We also are fortunate to have Tara Bradway, who is a performer, director, and writer who has acted, produced, or directed more than 50 productions of Shakespeare. Her noteworthy performances include the title roles in productions of Hamlet and Richard II, as well as Portia in The Merchant of Venice and Cassius and Julius Caesar. She holds a PhD in English with a concentration in performance and Shakespeare studies. She also writes historical fiction, rescues dogs, and lives in upstate New York. And she has recently been shortlisted for a Historical Novel Society Prize for biographical and historical fiction for her work in progress entitled Little Queen, the story of Isabelle of Valois, who the Shakespeareans in the audience will know as the Queen in Richard II. I'm Steve Mentz. I teach Shakespeare and Environmental Humanities at St. John's University in New York, and I also live in Connecticut, and I'm a longtime festival goer. My most recent book, Sailing Without Ahab, entwines the global trajectory of Melville's Moby Dick with ocean swimming right here in the Connecticut shoreline. I've also written a bunch of other books, including An Introduction to the Blue Humanities and At the Bottom of Shakespeare's Ocean, and I live just across the bridge in Short Beach, Branford. And so what I think we'll start with, we're going to move up into two performance pieces that Tara has prepared for us, one of which will have a sound accompaniment that I hope that some members of the audience will help with. But I thought we would just give each of the two guest panelists kind of a couple minutes to talk about your relationships with Lear, with the play, and also your personal experiences of climate change in the present and how those two things might speak to each other. So, David, you want to take it from there?
Sure. Okay. Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful introduction. So, my relationship with Lear, I've been studying Shakespeare since I was an undergrad at Trinity College, so from about 2004, we'll say, so 20 years. And Lear was not a play that I gravitated towards initially. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later in terms of why. But getting into it now and later in life, one of the things that really strikes me about the play is the emotional impact of what is actually happening in the play, particularly as it pertains to these issues that we're talking about with respect to climate change and just the way that weather elements and everything affect us. And so one of the primary sort of phrases that kept sticking out to me when I was rereading the play recently was just that there's fear. There's a lot of fear in the characters who are talking about the storm and how it's, one, even just fear of the fact that they can sense that it's coming, right? So we're getting this anticipation that's building up, but then also fear of what it means to be vulnerable to the elements of that storm. And so I was particularly struck by that this time around, because as somebody who focuses on social justice and race in my work, I'm thinking about today in our own world, and even we can look at New Haven, for instance, for example, and think about how social class matters with respect to this issue of climate change. Who does it affect more? How does it affect them? Who does it affect less? And then we can get into the questions about why. And the why is very much linked to two things that are of interest to me in my work. One of them is, of course, environmental racism is a real thing, and we can also see that along class lines as well, how certain people who are the most vulnerable in our society are affected the most and in various ways by the issues as it pertains to climate change, different structures in place in our systems that are creating these kinds of changes, even on a geographical level. But then also that's linked to a subject that I don't think a lot of people think about as much, which is then medical racism, right? Because if you're suffering from issues that are being sort of placed upon you because of changes in the environment, and partly because of changes that human beings are making, then when you've got to go seek out medical care, and there's a great book that was recently written by Dr. Uche Blackstock called Legacy, an instant New York Times bestseller, on this issue of medical racism, that gets us into a whole nother way of how the issue of climate change and environmental changes affect everyone. And ultimately, what I think I take away from a play like Lear is how fragile human life is, right? The fragility of human life is constantly being sort of put front and center in this play, especially in the middle of the play. And there are some lines from it that I love that we can maybe get into as well. And the last thing that I'll say, in terms of thinking about Lear, I recently saw a news article. There's an island off the coast of Panama where, because of rising sea levels, there are the indigenous people who lived there for several generations. They all just had to be displaced from the island to the mainland. And that is a direct result of climate change. So I just want us to think broadly about how this play, written over 400 years ago, is still very much relevant and matters in our world today in so many different ways. So thank you.
My relationship with Lear, I think, is a little bit similar to David's, that I didn't connect with it initially. I read it in high school as a senior, and it didn't really speak to me. And when I started pursuing Shakespeare performance as an actor, when Lear would come up for auditions, which wasn't that often, I was interested in Cordelia and never comprehended that I would ever get to perform any little bit of Lear himself. So I'm also struck by what David had to say about fragility and vulnerability is very much the actor's predicament, to go up on stage and be vulnerable to the elements of the audience. So I come to think about Lear in that respect as well, that he is the character is very vulnerable to the elements in the environment, but practically speaking, in the theater, what are those elements? Technically, how do you construct them with lights? How do you construct them with sound? how do you construct it for the experience of the audience, and the way that the actor playing that role, or in the case of the production, this playing that role, and how they may become the storm. So I think that's all I'll say for now, so that we can get.
Yeah, I think we're gonna move toward our first performance, and what we're really trying to think about here is how does theater create the experience of environmental fragility, physical vulnerability, and so we have some props that we will pass out to the audience.
We
Tara?
do. So Steve is going to be playing the rain stick.
I'll be playing the rain
so
stick.
we have some rain. David is going to do a little thunder on the drum. So whatever you feel. Okay. And I have a couple of thunder sticks that I'm going to bring out to the audience. I'll show you briefly how to use those, and just ask you to listen in the speech for the references that will sort of give you the direction for when to incorporate the thunder. So
yeah, and for anyone keeping score at home, this is the blow wind speech in Act 3, Scene 2. The moment in which Lear first encounters the storm with his body. Tara, do you want to introduce your mask also? This is a special treat.
So my husband and I went to Venice for Carnivale this year, and Venice jumped the line of our vacation spots because, thanks to climate change, it is disappearing. Yeah. So we wanted to visit before we left, and one of the things we were most intrigued about with Venice is the tradition of commedia dell'arte. So we were wandering all the little alleys in Venice searching for a mask shop. And we found one. So this is made by an artist who's been in Venice for decades, hand-making commedia masks. So this is Pantalone, and this is a handmade mask out of leather and signed by the artist who made this 2 years ago. So I felt a little unequal to playing Lear in my own skin, so I decided to borrow Pantalone's skin and hair with the wrinkles and eyebrows. So thank you for letting me introduce Pantalone.
Your cheeks, rage, blow, you cataracts and hurricanos, spout till you have drenched our steeples, drown the cocks, you sulphurous and thought-executing fires, vaunt couriers of oak-cleaving thunderbolts, singe my white head, and thou, all shaking thunder, strike flat the thick rotundity of the world, crack nature's molds, all germing, spill at once that makes ingrateful man, rumble thy belly full, spit fire, spout rain, I tax not you, you elements with unkindness. I never gave you kingdom, called you children. You owe me no subscription. Then let fall your horrible pleasure. Here I stand, your slave, a poor, infirm, weak, and despised old man. But yet I call you servile ministers that will with two pernicious daughters join your high-engendered battles against a head so old and white as this. Oh, oh, 'tis foul. no. I will be the pattern of all patience. I will say nothing.
Yes. Thank you to the thunder in the audience. That's such an amazing speech, and I love thunder behind us. And one of the things I love so much about it is the crossing of the emotional and the environmental, right? That it is, the thunder which will form an alliance with the daughters that have made Lear mad, and the final nothing that he comes back to, even at this point, like he's still kind of stuck on the nothing of the first scene. And I guess the thing that I thought we might talk about a little bit is how do we, what do we understand Lear to be experiencing? He's experiencing both the kind of crisis within his family, his own exiling of his favorite daughter, his other two daughters exiling him, the human and emotional crisis in the family, which is somehow mapped onto and also mapped back by the radical experience of being naked in the storm, right?
Yeah, it's overwhelming. And one thing I'll mention, I had mentioned this to Steve yesterday. This is such a particular challenge to do a speech like this, and sort of drop the needle in at a 10, and without a way to build up to it, without the background of the family dynamics and the age. So I think for me actually, the weather sounds really helped. So thank you. This was the first time that I've really gotten to do that with those sounds. So as a piece of performance, having those elements of the dangerous weather really helped. But that's also such a troubling dynamic in terms of climate change, that those things don't help. But I wonder if can we utilize them as alarms to galvanize actual work to be done about that. So I think that's the work of the theater, is to put us in those mindsets in the black box of the theater, so that we can actually think through and talk through. So this panel is a really nice extension of that.
Yeah, and I would say I see everything sort of summed up in the final words of that speech. "Oho, 'tis foul." I think what Lear is calling attention to there is the foulness of all of these things that have happened in the play thus far being consolidated for him in this moment, and even internally. So it's the foulness of life, it's the foulness of love, it's the foulness of these familial family dynamics that he has, and then we're here now experiencing what we sort of understand or think of as maybe the foulness of nature. It also, for me, represents the unpredictability of all of this, right? Like, there are homes in California that are falling off cliffs right now because of the rising sea levels and erosion that's being caused, again, by climate change. And so what this gets me back to in this conversation about the fragility of human life is how much is actually out of our control, like particularly when it comes to nature. We can realize day in and day out how small we are, and also how much we cannot control certain things. Like even that issue they had in Dubai recently was very, very freaky.
Yeah, I think about the smallness of actions like refusing a straw at a restaurant, or praising somebody for having a paper straw. Is such a small action, how can we feel like we're actually making a difference? Because those things do matter and they do add up. But what else can we do? Because we don't want to be like Lear at the end of that speech. I won't do nothing. Because that's not useful. And so much of what happens in the play is in Lear's control. He's the one who sets the whole thing in motion. So how does he stop it?
And we talked also yesterday about the commands, right? Strike flat, this thick rotundity of the world. He continues to believe, as the monarch, even though he's given away his power, that he has this physical, temporal, and even kind of theological or divine power. Like he can command the winds, he can command his daughters, he can command the fool. And the play, of course, shows that that's false, right? That he lacks the power to command that he believes he has. But this speech especially reminds us that in the moment of attempting to command the rain that is raining on your body, he is both asserting a kind of human control, a human mastery of the elements, that he's also in the process of failing of experiencing the opposite of, right? The measure of his command is also the measure of his vulnerability. And that contrast, I think, is really at the center of the play. To be a king and also to be subjected thus, as he says later.
Yes. And it's interesting also to think about, too, the text itself, though, does command the elements, the production elements of the play. So I had to ask you to listen for the references to thunder. So in one sense, the performance of it does command the elements. But inside the play, Lear is also just telling them to do things that they're already doing. So in a way, his commands are completely ineffectual.
Yeah, and I think it shows us, because kings were often treated or thought of as almost like gods on earth. And there's a lot of biblical language that resonates even with respect to parent-child relationships, for instance. And so what I was struck by is how Lear is more so asserting a desire for control over things that he can't control, like the term nature in the period. If we look at a play like Hamlet, for instance, old Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet, Hamlet's father, says to him at one point in the play, "If thou hast nature in thee, bear it not." And what he's really referring to there is, if you are my child, if you have my nature in you, then you will do what I'm asking you to do. And so I think something gets conflated perhaps in Lear's mind about the nature of his daughters and the nature of nature. But there's a disconnect there because he can't actually control nature, and he also couldn't control his daughters, obviously.
Yeah, no, it's a play, and it sort of comes to a climax in the middle, as like the things he thought he can control. Like he can't control the things he's supposed to be able to control: his family, his followers, his kingdom, and he then attempts to map that control, that rage for control, onto a larger world, right? So it's the contrast between this little world of man and this larger world of the storm. The title of our panel, Tempests of the Mind, is a line that comes up a little bit later in this scene, but when the title was actually chosen for us by the festival, and I was at first a little bit uncertain about it, because really what I want to think about happening in this scene is Shakespeare helping us think about real storms, right? About the hurricane season that is supposed to be the biggest hurricane season in the last whatever years, that is brewing in the superheated waters of the Caribbean right now, and is hopefully not going to come to our houses anytime soon, but could. And the way in which living with a violent and uncontrollable nature is increasingly the world that we live in, right? As the world heats. And so there is this, the Tempest is both in the mind and created through thundersticks and rain sticks and all the other tools that we have of the theater, but the theater also helps us think about the tempests that are not just in the mind, that are in the world, in the physical space.
Sorry, I just had a random thought, because you said something that I always get struck by this, when something happens, whether it's like a mudslide or whatever, and it gets referred to as violent.
Yep.
Is it nature being violent, or is nature responding to the violence of man? That's something that just thought of. It may make no sense. I don't know, but yeah.
And I mean, a mudslide is violent only if you build a house in the way of where the mud wants to slide, right? If we wouldn't build so many houses near forests in the West Coast, there's a huge fire in Sonoma right now that is threatening a friend of mine's house, and it's really scary and it feels very violent. It's also true that we have, as a society and a culture, decided to build lots of expensive houses near places where fire is natural.
Yeah, and so I think you're helping me get to my point. So I feel like we need to put the onus on man for the choices that we make to encroach upon these territories, even with respect to animals. Like there are animals showing up in spaces, particularly in urban settings, where they didn't usually go because they've been sort of kicked out of their natural habitats.
Yeah, I think that the play definitely helps us think about that, because Lear is really the culpable figure in the play. He is the one who invites the violence of the storm in his language, but also in his actions, very thoughtlessly, thinking that he's getting one thing and ultimately he gets another. I think that it's similar to the way we're building and using fossil fuels and thinking about the world in a way that we can utilize it instead of how can we live with it. Because like Lear is trying to, with his language, control the storm that's uncontrollable instead of finding a way to exist with it.
Yeah. And he's also believing that the storm is ultimately caused by the bad daughters, like the supposedly bad daughters,
right?
Who are like, he ultimately can't see beyond his own kind of emotional catastrophe, like his extremely narrow vision of like having ruptured his relationship with his favorite daughter and also with his non-favorite daughters. Like all the family is broken, and he can't see any other cause.
Right.
Than
it's just
than
the two daughters who join
with
the storm,
with these storms.
And so it's all their fault, but it's really not.
Yes, and it's real right. So Lear becomes a figure for Anthropocene man. I mean, to use the sort of the professorial word Anthropocene, the age of man, a word that lots of us use, came from a Nobel Prize-winning chemist about 20 years ago. The age of man, meaning the age in which anthropic actions, primarily the burning of fossil fuels, have become a major driver in global climate. There's a lot of debate about when it started and what exactly it means, but the broad sense of understanding that on some level, humanity, or rich humans, or oil companies are to blame for, again, you have to sort of identify your anthropos, but Lear, in his fantasy of control, is also a fantasy of being the anthropos of the Anthropocene, being the man, sort of capital M, who runs the world. And so the world can only be understood in relationship to his own emotional relationship, especially with his family and other dependents, right? He understands everybody in relationship to his sort of need for control and domination.
And I would link this also to his sort of mental health state, too. I think what is happening for him is he's projecting. He's projecting his inability to control his household. He's searching now for something to control because he can't control what he thought he could control, which would be his daughters. And this reminds me, mental health is something that feeds into my work as well, but it reminds me too of how we don't get to see typically in Shakespeare plays, because things happen so quickly, how a character's healing process. But I think if he were able to heal his emotional wounds from his daughter, right, or daughters, maybe things might look different for him. Instead of searching for control, he'd actually have real solutions to his problems.
Yeah, it's one of the things that the play doesn't do for us is give us that what if. So I feel like that's kind of what we're here for. Is like what are the things that if we were looking for the happy ending of King Lear, what is it that we could change? If we're looking for the happy ending of climate change, what is it that we can change to improve that situation, to have a healing process?
Yeah, I mean, there is in Act 4, when Lear and Cordelia are reunited, there is a lot of language about a kind of beneficent nature, a healing nature. All you unpublished virtues of the earth is one of Cordelia's lines, as if there's a kind of, the storm is hostile nature in the middle of the play, and then when Cordelia comes back, she is smile and rain at once. She is, she represents the, I don't have all the lines in the top of my head right now, but something about the generative corn, like she's the harvest and the corn and the nature that supports. In this play, it doesn't turn out to be enough because everybody dies at the end of King Lear, but there is at least a movement to try to recapture something beneficent coming from the earth. So maybe we should move on to the second speech, which is also from the king and also about need and vulnerability, and maybe even more about the kind of human neediness of the king, as grappling in this case with his eldest daughter rather than directly with the storm. This is from Act 2.
Were gorgeous. Why, nature needs not what thou gorgeous wear'st, which scarcely keeps thee warm, but for true need. You heavens, give me that patience I need. You see me here, you gods, a poor old man, as full of grief as age, wretched in both. If it be you that stirs these daughters' hearts against their father, fool me not so much to bear it tamely. Touch me with noble anger, and let not women's weapons, water drops, stain my man's cheeks. No, you unnatural hags. I will have such revenges on you both that all the world shall. I will do such things, what they are yet, I know not, but they shall be the terrors of the earth. You think I'll weep? No, I'll not weep. I have full cause of weeping, but this heart shall break into 100,000 flaws or e'er weep. Oh, fool! I shall go mad.
So this is from a little bit earlier in the play, and he's in the throes of the big fight with his eldest daughter, Goneril, and you can see that the things that are going to come out a little bit later in the storm scene are already kind of welling up. His own tears and his desire to do something he doesn't know what, but it will be the terrors of the earth. And there is a way, I think, in which the terrors of the earth is what we get in the storm scene. I also love the reference to madness at the end there. I think about this in relation to your work, David.
No,
and I don't know if you wanted to pick up from there.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
Or both his kind of resolution that he will go mad, which is, preview of coming attractions, I guess, but also the focus on true need. Like the experience of being a human in this play is fun. Even the king, right? Even the king with all his power and all his capacity to change things and order people around, that experience is fundamentally one of unmet need. Like true need is the thing that he can't get. The need to get his youngest daughter to say that she loves him, even though he's a total monster and a bully, and he's like screwing up her engagement. And also, like, there's some need that is untouchable within him and within really all the humans in the play.
Yeah, and I think it's he asks for patience.
Yeah.
That's the thing that he asks for, and it's what where the other speech ended. To say, I will be the pattern of all patience, but he's not. He's so impatient. He's so impatient. So in a way, I guess it is what he needs.
Hard.
Patience is hard. It's very hard. But I also think that especially in terms of catastrophic climate change, we don't have time for patience.
Right.
We do not have time for patience. So, yeah. I don't know. That was all I had on that.
Right, and what we have is this experience of need, right? How do you respond to need? Like, you could say, oh, patience, like, it'll be fine, we'll just wait a little bit longer.
Right.
But, like, what's the alternative? Like, how do we respond to the urgency of our need, his need, the fool's need?
Yeah, and I guess to turn maybe we're not ready to go here yet, but I was thinking about the fear of madness.
Yeah.
The fear that, what it does it does feel like going mad. The whole experience of living through catastrophic climate change and all the things that are happening, if they're not happening to you directly, they do feel like a tempest of the mind. So how do we resolve the fear of going mad, the fear of doing nothing, with the urgency of the moment?
Well, I think. Mind if I turn to Kent's speech? So Kent's speech in Act 3, Scene 2, for me, is a place where I think, again, that what you're talking about comes together. He says, "Since I was a man, such sheets of fire, such bursts of horrid thunder, such groans of roaring wind and rain, I never remember to have heard." And so this idea of memory, I have I think she's going to be 87 years old this year. My grandmother, we talk like every day, and she lives in South Carolina. We often talk about the weather. And she has said to me repeatedly over the years how she has seen changes. So we're talking about somebody who was born in the 1930s, has seen changes in our weather patterns that she's never seen before, never experienced in her life. And that is scary to hear. It's also scary to experience as somebody who grew up in Connecticut my entire life. Our falls are not what they used to be back in the 80s and the early 90s. I miss the fall chill. Now it's more like September, summer. And I think what Kent is drawing attention to there is just the fact that these changes in the weather patterns have a significant impact on us, even on emotional and psychological levels. The fact that this is something that is being recalled for him, but he can't actually place it in his mind because he's never seen it before. There's almost like a misalignment in terms of what he remembers, like December should be versus what it is now, for instance.
Yeah, I think that speech, I mean, it also connected to this speech of Lear's and the one we heard just a few minutes ago, is a recognition, or maybe recognition is wrong, a kind of emphasis on the really painful friction between the way the world actually is and the way we as humans would like it to be, right? Like Lear is desperate to connect the storm to his daughters, because if it's his daughters and his family, then they can be obedient or disobedient, but they're like in his control.
Yeah, he can make sense of it.
He can make sense of it. Whereas the world that actually surrounds us, and this is increasingly true during climate change, but my sense is that Shakespeare understood it to be true also for him, and in the 16th and 17th century, is that the weather does things to you. Like, being a vulnerable human in the world means we are subject to cataracts and hurricanos. Hurricano, again, like a professor tangent, is a Native American word. It shows up in the English language only about 100 years before this play, or maybe even less than that. It is a reference to a kind of storm that England still doesn't experience. A hurricane is an American storm. And there's this sense that the world isn't going to be kind to us, isn't going to be legible to us, is only going to be like, it's not going to answer our need. That's why the word need is so important in the play.
And I think the end of Kent's speech there actually wraps up nicely what you said. I didn't read that last part. He says, man's nature cannot carry the affliction nor the fear.
Right.
And so there's a theory, I think, even in his speech, or an anxiety, if you will, about how much we can actually endure because we are, in fact, so fragile.
Yeah.
Yeah, our bodies and our experiences are insufficient to hold that.
Yeah, and the distinction between affliction and fear, right? Affliction is just the physical suffering, which we probably aren't strong enough to endure. But fear is the anxiety produced by the possibility that there'll be more affliction and more suffering. And in some ways, I think Shakespeare is very carefully saying that, like, as bad as it is to be in the weather, it's almost worse to be afraid of the weather.
Yeah.
That those are the things we can't bear as humans.
Yeah, I mean, look at this heat we're experiencing today, and there's more on the way.
Yep. Right. I mean, it's actually not that bad today, but it's supposed to be really bad by Thursday, right? There's always this way in which one experiences hostile weather. It's like, well, is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better? Is it going to, flood my basement? Is it, is it going to touch these little oases of structure or control that we have in our families, in our homes, in our lives, that we would like them to be protected? And
also, you mentioned structure. I think, too, about how these patterns and changes with the weather, they are restructuring our worlds. And so maybe places or spaces that we used to be able to put ourselves in, we can no longer. And so there's a lot of loss, and including the loss of human lives and people's livelihoods and habitats that comes with climate change and not controlling our sort of part in the problem.
Yeah, I'm struck, and I'm always struck when I teach this play and watch this play and talk about this play, that, like, it all sounds pretty bad. And it is. I think that Lear is really good at exposing, like, our efforts to gather up hopefulness and then the failure of those efforts. And I also, like, always having the floor pulled out from underneath you is really uncomfortable. And so I wonder if there's any, like, one of the projects of art is to make us aware of things that are hard to be aware of, that are uncomfortable to live with. And I think that Lear is as good as any work of art at bringing us into this space of not thinking that we can't bear either the affliction or the fear. Like, that's the thing that Lear does almost maybe better than any other play. But it's also brutal to be there. That's why the theater ends and you go out at the end and you get to come back to the world. And I just, like, what is it that we take from a play that is so bleak and so catastrophic? Like, what is the thing that we take from it? And I'm thinking a little bit about the end of the play and the death of Cordelia. The final lines that are given to Edgar are Albany, but were cut in the production we saw in New Haven this weekend. So it ended just with Cordelia dying and Lear dying. But, like, what is it that we take from this was the question we had over coffee yesterday, Tara. Like, why do we like this play so much when it's so grim?
The way I think about it is that I want to go to see King Lear. I want to go to see Hamlet. I want to go to see Macbeth and, like, have my heart ripped out and stomped on and squashed like Gloucester's jelly eyes, like that. there's a safety in the theater of getting to experience this huge range of human emotions. 'Cause we don't experience the emotions of King Lear. We don't experience those every day. The experience of such loss and this really abject fear. We kind of, I think, in a time of catastrophic climate change, we need a place to experience that abject fear and figure out what do we do with it. That's why I like to go to such an unremitting, brutal tragedy. So to get to feel those emotions in a safe space is a luxury, because there are a lot of people who are feeling those things, and it's extremely urgent for them. For us, we can experience it in a theatrical space, and I think that gives us an obligation to figure out what to do with it, because it is a luxury for us.
I'm thinking out there. There's a lot from this play, and I usually don't think about Lear from this angle, so that's probably why I'm like smiling, because I'm like, ooh, new stuff. Yeah. I'm very excited. You hear the cliche phrase, art imitates life, and also life imitates art, vice versa. I think when we take that into consideration, there's a lot we can pull from this play, beyond it being a tragedy. And tragedy actually is my favorite genre, and not because of the blood and gore. I just think there are so many rich lessons that we get from these plays that captivate us because they create these worlds that are scary, but in fact are not so far removed from our own, as Lear shows us with respect to this climate change issue. And so I think we get warnings from these kinds of plays. I think there are records, in a way, of perhaps things that Shakespeare was pulling in from his own world that we can think about. I also think the word instincts came to mind for me as you were talking, because I think with respect to these changes, whether it's climate or whatever the situation might be, instincts are very important for us as human beings. And I think a lot of this technology stuff, AI, all that, we're losing a lot. But I always say to people, I'm like, you don't see the birds sticking around when it's hurricane time and one's definitely coming. And there's something instinctual and innate in, I think, all of us. And then the other line the last thing I'll say is that I think it was repeated twice in the play, Tom's a cold. Yeah. He kept referring to the fact that he was cold. And so eventually he does get offered a place of warmth. But again, I think instincts and also being there with and for one another and supporting one another, right? He needed shelter, and that was suggested for him. And so if we were less individualistic in how we operate in the world and more collectivistic, especially in the United States, working together, I think, would help provide solutions to the problem of climate change, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that especially through the Poor Tom plot and the sort of way in which it reminds Lear about the plight of houseless poverty in his kingdom. Does he do a really good job, coming up with a plan to take care of houseless poverty? No. He's too busy dying. But we can think about the plight of houseless poverty here in New Haven, elsewhere in the United States, in this massively rich society that we live in, where there is a lot of houseless poverty, right, within all the parts of the United States, and especially here. And so the way in which, the particular insight that Lear has to be brutalized in order for it to come to him, we maybe can get it. Well, we don't really need to go to the theater to get it, but we can receive it from the theater if that is a way that it successfully communicates to us some of these lessons that are difficult to get through and that need to come from multiple angles and venues and genres and modes.
Yeah.
So, and I do want to go, we're running low on time, but I want to go to audience questions if we have some. If we want to, we have microphones in the,
I am almost as old as your grandmother, and in my lifetime and hers, many species have been extinct, have become extinct. And when I was 10 years old, the world was all worried about population growth. And China put in a one-child policy. At that time, there were 2.5 billion people in the world. Now there are over 8 billion people in the world. And I think that's one of the major reasons that we have wiped out so many habitats and expanded into places we shouldn't, and have caused climate change in many ways. And I think that whereas in the play, Lear can't control the weather, we as a society, all of us in this world, with our huge numbers and our growing greed, have in fact caused the changes in the weather. And it just gets worse when you think about the richest, or one of the richest persons on the planet, who just received, what, $52 billion as pay for his work, instead of putting that towards housing for people or food for people. I think we just keep compounding our problems ourselves.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think when you were talking about the population increases and you mentioned greed, capitalism came right to my mind, because I think a lot of this, when we look at, people building houses in places, or they'll buy the property that has a house on it, tear it down to build up a new one so they can there's a lot being wasted in those processes, and it's all usually for self-gain.
And King Lear is a play that is obviously substantially before the large scale the phenomenon of industrialization and global capitalism, maybe the beginning of a kind of colonial expansion in that period. But the play also is really struggling between this nostalgic idea of kingship and loyalty and unity, and the modern world that the bastard son Edmund is like, I'm gonna have lands by wit, though I cannot have them by birth, right? The sense that there is a world of individual agency, which is super attractive to theater goers. Like when we as Americans understand about the claims of individual agency, and I think the play is really interested in the struggle between the collective and the individual in ways that you were talking about just a minute ago, David. Yeah. Do we have other questions? Yeah, maybe just one more.
Hi, thank you so much for a great talk. The notion of struggle is making me think a lot about the competition between all of the different sibling sets in the play, and also making me think about what started the competition at the beginning was King Lear's saying that Cordelia was his favorite daughter. And I've only seen the show, I haven't interrogated Shakespeare, I have no idea if that really is in any of the speeches or subsequent texts in the play, but it really makes me think that he, by playing favorite and not interrogating that himself, not exploring what that means to Cordelia. Maybe she didn't express her love to him because she didn't want to, incite the wrath of her two siblings who were so angry because everyone knew she was the favorite. And likewise with Edgar and Edmund and a lot of that competition. And that also made me think about how we as humans have engaged with the earth in very competitive ways, and maybe historically we needed to see the wild as the opponent in order to conquer it so that we could eat and drink. But how has our experience of the world in a competitive, as our foundation of competitiveness, I think impacting our efforts to address climate change? So just wondering about those themes of competition for both families and the earth.
I mean, that that's back to the capitalism question that David raised
I
just
was
a second ago.
thinking about Dubai as a place where, like they have, I just learned this actually recently, they have the tallest building in the world, but it doesn't actually have a proper functioning like sewage system. So like they take the, waste out in trucks. That's how they do that in this tallest building in the world. And I'm like, that's crazy. So the infrastructure is not very good, but at least they can say they have the tallest building in the world, and that draws people, and they're making money. So yeah, it's definitely again wrapped up in greed and competition, and I'm sure patriarchy has a lot to do with that too.
Yeah.
And I think also the idea of division. That even before the idea of the competition and the favoritism comes in is because Lear is choosing to divide his kingdom. And that's, to go back, David, to your point earlier, that if we were less individualistic and more collective, less divisive, I think we would all do a lot better. Like in this last speech, Lear talks about his heart breaking into 100,000 flaws or fragments before he'll cry, and like no, like don't break things up. Like keep things together. It'll just be a lot more fruitful.
Yeah, and that moment that you point to in the opening scene, in which Lear comes to his daughters and asks the thing that is like the thing that no parent can ever ask, right? And can't even really think about. Which of you, shall we say, doth love us the most? And it was performed by Tony Torn, one of the 10 Lears this weekend, and just this gorgeous, open, needy, horrifying, like to hear that from a parent is the most monstrous thing in the world. Like that was the moment in which Lear the Tyrant was the most palpable and unanswerable, right? Again, because it comes out of this place of emotional need, and also from a complete failure to understand that Cordelia might have other things on her mind as she's choosing which of the two European dukes nobles she's going to marry, other than loving us meaning the royal we, the royal father. And so that the massive egotism of Lear at that moment strikes me as really important for understanding the history of climate change and industrialization and the degradation of the environment as a product of Anthropocene history. But it's also located in a deeply human need that he just can't quite believe that there might be somebody other than himself in the universe. And that is horrifying, and also like something that we can, I think, respond to in some ways.
Yeah. So we just got the signal that we're out of time. So last thing I'm going to say is I have some flyers with my book information on it. So if anybody's interested, I'll stand out there somewhere and feel free to take one of the flyers. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.